John, do you want to give a little introduction about yourself?
Sure, and thank you for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is John Barentine, and I am an astronomer based in the United States. My background is in optical and infrared astronomy. I'm also involved in public policy and dark skies advocacy, and I currently run my own freelance consultancy that works on dark skies issues around the world.
Interesting. Thank you for being here as first thing. And so let's start with the question. So what is the difference between quiet skies and radio quiet skies?
That's a good question, and I'm glad that it was asked, because there's some confusion at times between these terms, as we have started using the words quiet skies to refer to the phenomenon of large satellite constellations and the impact that they have on the night sky, mostly in the sense of the changing visual appearance that's due to the increasingly large number of objects that's up there orbiting the Earth. We have for several decades referred to radio quiet as the conditions that are on the ground that contribute to radio astronomy being successful from near the Earth's surface. So if we say radio quiet, what we mean are areas where there is very little natural background at radio frequencies. These are usually protected zones in certain countries where there are legal restrictions on what kinds of electronic devices can operate in those areas in order to make them as minimally strong, to use, for lack of a better word, to have that radio background so that radio astronomers can hear very faint signals and the radio frequencies from the universe. When we say quiet skies, nowadays we're mostly referring to this notion that the visual appearance of the night sky, so not at radio wavelengths, but at optical wavelengths, is changing because of the phenomenon of large satellite constellations. So if we have achieved radio quiet conditions, it means that there's very little electronic noise. It's good for radio astronomy. If we say quiet skies, we're mainly referring to a night sky where there's not an excessive number of satellites that distract from a more natural view of the cosmos.
Okay. And so why do we need to keep our skies radio quiet overall?
It's important to keep the conditions near the ground radio quiet so that we can continue to study the universe at radio wavelengths. So we're talking about a part of the electromagnetic spectrum where the wavelengths are very long, and that's normally due to lower energy phenomena in the universe, although there are some high energy things that happen in the universe that produce some radio waves. But there's a whole part of that spectrum that we can only probe effectively if there's not too much radio interference on the ground. There's some radio astronomy that can be done from space, but all kinds of scientific research done from space are necessarily more complicated, more expensive than they are here on the ground. And we are already beginning to look forward to a future in which there is more of a human presence on places like the Moon and Mars that have been looked at as a potential site for radio telescopes. We might want to put a radio telescope on the far side of the Moon, for example, because it would be a naturally very radio quiet environment with very little presence of the kinds of electronics that can create interference. But of course, if suddenly we have a lot of satellites orbiting the Moon, if we have a lot of radio transmissions between bases on the ground on the Moon, it could be difficult to do that work. So if we want to continue to be able to study the universe at these wavelengths, whether it's from the Earth's surface, from the Moon, or from Mars, then we need to take steps in order to try to keep those environments as radio quiet as we can.
Okay, and a question related to that. Why are we building a radio telescope on Earth and not sending them on space to observe from the skies?
That's also a very good question, and it relates to the bigger question of why don't we just move all of our astronomy enterprise into space? The thinking is that there's not the kind of interference we get on the ground, whether it's radio interference for radio telescopes or light pollution as it impacts optical and infrared telescopes. The short answer is that it's simply very expensive to operate in space. Although the costs of launching hardware into space have decreased in recent years and it is becoming more economical to put facilities in space, they are still a very expensive proposition. Some of the listeners will have heard, of course, of the James Webb Space Telescope that is producing fantastic images right now. But that was a program that cost billions of dollars and took many years to complete and transport the telescope to the right location. So there's a balance. We want to do some of our astronomy from space. We want to do some of it from the ground. We can do a certain amount from the ground with a lot of high efficiency relative to the cost, but there are certain things that we can only study essentially if we go to space. So we want to be able to do both. And so as a consequence, we will, for a long time into the future, we will want to keep conditions on the ground radio quiet as much as we can in order to continue to do that work very efficiently from the ground. The new challenge, of course, is that although we can set aside areas on the ground as radio quiet zones that are meant to have very little radio interference, it becomes more difficult now when we have many thousands of satellites in orbit around the Earth transmitting radio signals to the ground. It's harder to define a region that is free of that radio frequency interference. And that, I think, is becoming the challenge of our time.
Okay, and instead moving away from radio quiet zone, but regarding quiet skies, why instead we need to keep our skies quiet?
We should keep our skies as quiet as possible, again, referring to this idea of ensuring that there are not too many satellites that are interfering with our ability to see the night sky in order to continue that astronomy research program and enterprise that we're running from here on the ground. We know that there are certain impacts to telescopes that are trying to see very faint light from the cosmos. If a satellite happens to pass in front of the telescope's field of view during an exposure, it can damage the data that the telescope is trying to collect. And there are times when we will be looking at phenomena that are very unusual, don't last for very long. We can only observe them under certain circumstances. And if we happen to be looking in that direction when a satellite comes past, we might lose the opportunity that that represents. It's not to say that there should not be satellites. I should be very clear about that. Our intent is not to create a world in which there are simply no satellites orbiting the Earth. I think the challenge for us is to figure out how to optimize this problem, how to optimize the number of satellites that are orbiting the Earth to provide the services that we want for the development of the space economy without threatening the value of the astronomical research that we're trying to do from the ground. And we will, as with the radio telescopes, we will do a certain amount of optical and infrared astronomy in space, but that will never completely replace the astronomy that we do from the ground every night. So whether it is for a professional telescope that's trying to observe the cosmos, if it's an individual or a group who are just out to see the stars at night, ideally we want that night sky to be as quiet as possible in the sense that there is the least number of visible satellites that are affecting that view, whether it for whatever purpose that is for that people are engaging. And that's what we're all seeking to establish right now is where is that balance that gives us the social benefits of the development of space, but also protects the night sky for astronomy research.
Okay, we are talking a lot about this satellite constellation, and like they're a bad thing for astronomy, and they are, but what are the benefits of actually sending a constellation of satellites into space?
There are a number of possible benefits to satellite constellations that are enabling communication on a global scale that we have never really had before. There are billions of people in the world that are not connected to the internet, for example. And we know that there are distinct benefits socially and economically to improving that connectivity. And it can be everything from commerce in certain parts of the world that's not possible right now, providing emergency services. Something that a lot of people don't think about is how many people on our planet live in places that are otherwise not served, for example, by conventional telephone service or even low-speed terrestrial internet. and they don't have access to the kind of immediate response of public services as the many of us who live in cities do. So that's something that satellites are uniquely positioned to offer. And we certainly don't want to stand in the way of that progress. There will certainly be other kinds of applications that we haven't even dreamed of yet that will only be possible if we launch groups of satellites. The question is where is the upper limit of what we can potentially put into orbit before we start having problems associated with the crowding of that orbit? So that's why we're looking at ways to make constellations of satellites smaller in numbers so that there are fewer of them that are necessary to provide the same service. If we can get them orbiting a little bit closer to the Earth, that means that they don't spend as much time in sunlight while we're on the night side of the planet so that we see them in reflected sunlight. And it also means fewer high-powered radio transmissions that could possibly interfere with radio astronomy. And so that's why through the IAU, we're working with the astronomical community, the business community, the commercial space operators that are developing these satellite constellations, and other stakeholders to try to find a solution that really works well for everybody who has an interest in the development of space.
Okay, so we are trying to work together towards the goal of finding the perfect balance, but there are actually laws for sending satellites into space in place, or it's just everybody can send everything to space?
There are laws that govern the way that space is used and determine the number of objects that can orbit the Earth and in what physical parts of space. It's a law that dates back to the 1960s during the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United Nations enacted a treaty called the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, and most of the countries in the world are parties to that treaty. And it has a few basic provisions that ensures that space remains accessible to all. It prevents nuclear weapons in space. It says that countries cannot make territorial claims on the moon or on other planets. And it makes countries liable for any damage or negative effects that might result from spacecraft that are launched from their territory. So for all the countries that are part of this treaty framework, they then set up their own national space policies or their own laws at the national level that say what people can and cannot do. But it requires groups of countries working together to ensure that the treaty is fairly implemented and that there are no misunderstandings, that we don't have accidents in space, et cetera. There's a group coordinated through the United Nations called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, that the countries that are parties to the treaty send delegations to every year, and they meet and they discuss items of current concern about how space is governed to ensure that the ideals of the Outer Space Treaty are met and that access is provided to all countries in the most efficient way possible. There's a group called the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU, that helps settle the orbits of the satellites, helps allocate the radio frequencies that they operate on. And so between the UN committee and the ITU, that sets the stage for the way the world's countries collectively govern the use of outer space. What we don't know is whether that's a good framework for dealing with the current situation that envisions thousands of objects orbiting the Earth, many more than there are now, and is something that the people who created the Outer Space Treaty in the 1960s probably could not themselves have envisioned. They were thinking of a world where the space race was still going on and the moon landings had not taken place yet, et cetera. So what we're finding out is how flexible is the Outer Space Treaty and its conventions to adapt to the current reality as space begins to fill up with many, many more thousand satellites than existed in the 1960s. And that's something that we're working on right now, is to try to figure out how we can update that framework to work as efficiently as possible, given what the new reality of the commercial uses of space is.
Okay, and when you are saying we are trying to figure out what are the organization in place for that, we are talking about countries altogether, or we're talking of private organization?
So the private organizations that are launching objects into space right now, these new up and coming space companies, they have to launch from somewhere on the Earth. So they have to decide what country they will operate from. Many of the operators launch from here in the United States, for example. And so they have to follow the laws that are set by our Congress and our executive branch agencies that deal with all of the phases of spaceflight, from when a rocket is launched carrying a satellite into space to eventually when the satellite comes back down at the end of its mission and is disposed of. And then while it's operating, we have agencies that deal with the aspects of the radio communication. And those rules and those laws at the national level ultimately trace back to my country's obligations under the Outer Space Treaty. So our laws have to ensure that the Outer Space Treaty's provisions are correctly implemented at the national level. And one of the most important parts of that is what they call the liability convention. So that if a private company launches a satellite from our territory in the United States, and let's say that that satellite comes down over another country and causes some kind of damage, the liability convention requires that the government of the launching country bears legal responsibility for the consequences of that action. And in turn, our national laws convey the responsibility onto the launching company to pay the damages or whatever needs to be done in order to correct for that situation. So in principle, any launching country should have its own local set of laws and regulations that dictate how the space companies operate from their territory and how to assign liability if there's any negative effect that results from that. So that's why it's not realistic that a company would go operate in a country where there are no laws. There are a handful of countries that are not part of the Outer Space Treaty. And in theory, a company can go to one of those countries, launch from its territory, cause problems for the other launching countries of the world, and not necessarily be held responsible for that. I think what prevents that sort of scenario from developing is that it would be bad for everybody, for every country and every space operator. Gradually, they're beginning to understand that there's only one orbital space around the Earth, and it has to be very carefully maintained for the benefit of everybody. And if one actor is behaving in a way that's dangerous to that environment, that it threatens access for everybody, including that actor. And that's part of what is supposed to deter people from behaving irresponsibly in terms of what they put into space.
Okay. And we are talking a lot about this crowded set of satellites in space, but there are ways to, let's say, take away all the satellites that are no longer useful.
Increasingly, it is considered a best practice to responsibly dispose of a satellite when it reaches its end of mission. And that's defined as the point at which the function for which the satellite was launched has been completed, and the satellite therefore no longer serves a useful purpose. If we just leave those satellites in orbit around the Earth, if they're in low orbits, they run a very high risk of either colliding with other satellites and creating debris, which in turn can then threaten other objects in orbit, or the satellite can fall back to the Earth in an uncontrolled way, and it might come down partially intact over a populated area, for example. It might cause damage on the ground. And so increasingly, countries are looking at it as a best practice, if not a law in some cases, that the operators must build into the satellite design a way to effectively dispose of them when they reach that end of mission. For satellites in low orbits that are only a few hundred kilometers above the Earth, the best practice is to deliberately deorbit the satellite, to bring it down in a controlled way. They tend to dispose of those satellites over the oceans far away from land so as to not threaten people or property on the land. It doesn't always go perfectly, but the satellite operators are getting better at being able to very highly target where their spacecraft come down. There are satellites that are up at much higher orbits, up at around 30,000, 40,000 kilometers in so-called geostationary orbits, where it's not effective from an energy perspective to try to bring them back down, but they can boost them up into higher orbits where the lifetimes of those orbits are on the order of thousands or tens of thousands of years. So in other words, it will take thousands of years for the satellite to fall back to the Earth on its own. And those are considered essentially permanently disposed. The same sense that we don't want collisions that are creating debris in the geostationary satellite belt. And so moving them up to higher orbits is considered the best way to do that. We're concerned about re-entering spacecraft as they affect the Earth. Of course, as I mentioned, some of them are disposed of in the oceans. Some of them contain toxic substances on board that might not be completely destroyed in the re-entry process, so they could potentially harm our oceans. Some of the material vaporizes during the descent through the atmosphere. To the degree that satellites are composed of metals like titanium and aluminum, those materials can end up in the upper atmosphere. And we have reason to believe that they affect atmospheric chemistry and might upset the thermal balance of the atmosphere, which is related to weather and to climate change. So there are a lot of considerations besides just where does the satellite go at the end of its mission. We're now starting to look at an environment around the Earth that's a continuum between the ground and the orbital space around the planet, and trying to keep all regions of that as free from pollution as possible. And that is gradually leading us to more solutions in how to best deal with the problem of what to do with satellites when they reach the end of their useful lives.
Okay. And I got maybe one last question, but we probably already talked a little bit about that. So the responsibility for excessive launching of satellite constellation is related to the country itself, then delegate to. And that's the case for all the states in the Outer Space Convention, right? Okay. So we answered all the question that you asked. So do you have any final thoughts or final regards before saying goodbye?
All I would add to our conversation today is that this is a topic where the public is invited to certainly learn more about the issue, to understand, what are the legal concerns, what are the environmental concerns around satellite constellations, both as they affect astronomy in the night sky, but also the Earth's environment, to know that there are regulatory processes operating in different countries, including their own countries. Even if they don't think that their countries participate in space, they are players in this situation because they participate in the Outer Space Treaty. And so they will send delegates to the meetings of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So to the extent that people may have opinions about this subject, I certainly urge them to contact their national authorities and let them know, and hopefully advocate for responsible and sustainable uses of outer space and regulation of large satellite constellations, so that, again, we can realize all of the benefits that stand to come with the development of space for commercial purposes, but also protecting the night sky and our environment. And if we make that our goal, I hope that we can be successful as a species in making this happen.
Okay. Thank you so much, John, for being with us and answering all
Thank you.
our questions.